Every morning at exactly the same hour, just as the mist began lifting from the fields around the village of Alderwick, Eleanor Barnes would hear the soft scrape at her garden gate. At first she thought it was the wind. The gate was old, warped by seasons of rain and frost, and when the breeze came from the east it sometimes shifted against the latch with a dry little rattle. But on the third morning in a row, when the sound came again just after dawn, Eleanor set down her teacup and went to the kitchen window. There, standing on the stone path between her vegetable beds, was a fox, not a blur of red slipping along a hedgerow, not a quick shadow in the lane at dusk. This fox stood plainly in her garden as if it belonged there. Its coat was deep russet, tipped with black along the legs, and its pale chest flashed in the early light. In its mouth it carried something small and white. Eleanor frowned and moved closer to the glass. The fox stepped to the back doorstep, lowered the object carefully onto the mat, then looked up at the house. A child's mitten, old, muddy, faded blue except for the sheep sewn onto the wrist. Eleanor's breath caught. She knew that mitten. Everyone in Alderwick knew it. For a long moment she simply stood motionless in the kitchen, one hand pressed against the sink, while the fox waited outside with unsettling patience. Then, as if satisfied that its task was done, it turned and trotted lightly back through the garden, slipped beneath the gate, and vanished into the morning fog. Eleanor didn't move for several seconds. Then she opened the back door and picked up the mitten with trembling fingers. It belonged to Oliver, her grandson. He had been missing for 6 months. In Alderwick, people still lowered their voices when they said his name. The village was small enough that everyone had joined the search that winter day when the child disappeared. He was 5 years old, bright-haired and restless, forever dragging sticks through puddles and asking questions no one could answer quickly enough. Eleanor had been watching him that afternoon while his mother, Claire, worked a double shift at the inn. It had been bitterly cold, with sleet starting to fall over the fields. Oliver had been playing in the back garden while Eleanor kneaded bread by the kitchen table, looking up every minute or two through the window. Then the vicar's wife came to the front door in tears over some urgent parish matter. Eleanor stepped away for what she would later insist was no more than 3 minutes. When she returned to the kitchen, the garden was empty. At first she assumed he had wandered behind the shed, or into the lane chasing one of the neighbor's chickens, or down toward the little bridge where children like to throw pebbles into the stream, but he was nowhere. Within an hour, the whole village was looking. By evening, the police had come. By nightfall, there were dogs, lanterns, search parties, shouted names echoing across the fields and woodland edge. They found one tiny boot near Blackthorn Copse. Nothing else. The stream had been dragged. The woods searched and searched again. Ponds checked. Wells opened. Hedges beaten back. Every old outbuilding and sheep pen for 3 miles examined. No one found Oliver. The case had slowly passed from emergency to heartbreak, from heartbreak to silence. Claire had stopped speaking to most people altogether. Eleanor had not forgiven herself for a single hour. And now, 6 months later, a fox had left the boy's mitten on her doorstep. By mid-morning, half the village was in her kitchen. Claire came first, white-faced and shaking so badly she could barely sit down. Then Mr. Pritchard from the post office. Then Reverend Hale, then 2 officers from the county station, including Detective Simon Reeves, who had worked the disappearance from the beginning and carried the permanent look of a man who slept poorly. Eleanor laid the mitten on the table between them all. Claire stared at it in silence. When she finally touched it, her fingers curled into it as though she were afraid it would vanish too. "It's his," she whispered. "It's Oliver's." Detective Reeves nodded grimly. "There's no question." He asked Eleanor to describe the fox 3 separate times. How close had it come? Did it limp? Was anything tied to the mitten? Had she followed it? Was there any sign that a person had placed it and the fox merely carried it? Eleanor answered as best she could, though her mind felt half outside her body. The fox had been healthy-looking, she said. Not mangy, not frantic. Calm, very calm. It had come to the door directly, as if it knew exactly where to go. The police searched Blackthorn Copse again that very day. So did half the men of Alderwick. though Reeves had asked them not to interfere. Nothing turned up. By evening, the village had split into camps of belief. Some thought the fox had simply dug up a long-buried item and happened to bring it into the village by chance. Others believed the mitten proved Oliver had died in or near the woods after all, and the fox had disturbed what remained. A few whispered something stranger, that animals knew things people didn't, and this fox had come with purpose. Eleanor said very little. The next morning, just after dawn, the scrape came again. This time she was waiting at the window. The fox appeared through the wet gray light, came up the same path, and laid a second object on the mat, a red plastic dinosaur. Oliver's favorite bath toy, the one he had carried in his coat pocket for weeks before he vanished. When Eleanor opened the door, the fox was still there. It stood only a few yards from her, amber eyes fixed on her face. No fear, no aggression, only a stillness so strange it made her knees weak. Then it turned, trotted to the gate, paused once, and looked back. "Wait," Eleanor whispered. By the time she reached the lane, it was gone. That day, there was no chance of keeping the matter quiet. Word spread beyond Alderwick into nearby villages. Reporters called the police station. Detective Reeves returned with a wildlife officer and a local tracker. They took the dinosaur, logged it, questioned Eleanor again, then followed every trace they could find near her cottage and along the hedgerows beyond. The wildlife officer, a practical woman named Mara Bell, examined the tracks in the mud and said what no one expected. "It's the same fox both mornings, adult vixen. She's not scavenging randomly. She's making a route." "To where?" Reeves asked. Mara looked toward Blackthorn Copse. "That's what I want to know." On the third morning, the whole village was awake before sunrise. Reeves had forbidden anyone from crowding Eleanor's property, but people watched from behind curtains and half-open doors. Claire sat in the kitchen, pale and rigid, both hands around a mug she never drank from. Eleanor stood beside the back window with the detective and Mara Bell while the sky slowly lightened to pearl. At 6:11, the fox appeared. Even Reeves, who believed in evidence and almost nothing else, went very still. The vixen came up the path carrying something thin and yellow, a child's crayon. She set it down on the doorstep, then turned her head toward the people inside the window. Claire made a sound Eleanor would hear in dreams for years. It was not quite a sob and not quite a gasp. Because she knew that crayon, too. Oliver had been drawing with it at Eleanor's table the afternoon he vanished. Mara moved first. "Open the door slowly." Eleanor did. The fox did not run. Its ears flicked once toward the detective, then toward Claire, then back toward the lane, and again, unmistakably, it walked a few paces away and looked back. Reeves straightened. "It's leading." Claire was already reaching for her coat. "No," Reeves said sharply. "You stay here." "I am not staying here." He looked at her, then at Eleanor, then at the fox waiting by the gate. Every rule of procedure argued against what was happening, but rules had not found the child. "Fine," he said at last, "but you stay with us." So just after dawn, in a silence broken only by boots on wet gravel and the distant calls of rooks, a small group followed a fox out of Alderwick. The vixen did not move quickly. She kept just far enough ahead to avoid being touched, slipping along hedgerows and across a narrow sheep path toward Blackthorn Copse. Every 20 yards she stopped and looked back to make sure the humans were still coming. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, Reeves had radioed for additional officers and instructed the rest of the village to stay back. Mara studied the fox with something like awe. "I've never seen behavior like this," she murmured. The copse was dark even in daylight, crowded with blackthorn, ash, and twisted hazel. It had been searched countless times in winter, again in spring, and twice after anonymous sightings were reported nearby. But summer growth had changed the land, thickening brush and swallowing old hollows beneath nettles and fern. The fox led them not toward the place where the boot had been found months ago, but deeper, toward a rise beyond the stream where an ancient estate wall had long since crumbled into heaps of stone and bramble. There she stopped. At first, no one saw anything unusual. Then Mara pointed. A narrow gap between the collapsed stones, half hidden by ivy. The kind of place too small to notice unless you were almost standing on top of it. Reeves crouched and shone his torch inside. The beam caught old roots, broken masonry, leaves, and then fabric. "Dear God," he whispered. Claire swayed where she stood. Within minutes, the scene became controlled chaos. Officers moved in, the area was cordoned off, and Claire was taken a few yards back, though she fought them bitterly. Eleanor remained rooted to the spot, her gloved hands clasped so tightly they hurt. Inside the hollow, beneath tangled roots and debris, they found a tiny hidden chamber formed by the collapse of the old boundary wall over what had once been a rabbiting shelter or estate drain. It was just large enough for a child to crawl into and become trapped if the soil shifted behind him. And inside it they found Oliver, not alive, but not lost anymore. He had likely wandered into the woods that winter afternoon chasing something small, perhaps even the fox itself, though no one could ever know, and crawled into the opening where a fall of loosened stone and frozen mud sealed him in before the weather worsened. The hidden chamber had muffled sound, hidden scent, and lain just far enough beyond the original search radius to escape notice beneath winter brush and snow. His small remains were wrapped in what was left of his coat. Near him lay a few of the objects he had carried that day: broken crayons, the mitten's mate, another toy, a button from his sweater. Claire collapsed before the officers could catch her. Eleanor did not cry at first. She only stared into the trees with the expression of someone whose worst hope had finally ended. The entire village fell into mourning again, but this time it was different. Grief with an answer was still grief, but it no longer had the same endless, tearing shape. Oliver could be brought home. Claire could bury her son. Eleanor could stop waking every morning into the hollow ache of not knowing. The fox, meanwhile, had vanished. For 2 days no one saw her. Then Mara Bell returned to the site alone at dawn, hoping to understand how the animal had found the chamber in the first place. She noticed tracks around the crumbled wall, old and new, and one detail no one else had thought to consider. There was a den nearby, not in the chamber itself, but in a brushy hollow just beyond it, cleverly concealed beneath roots and fern. Inside were signs of recent use: feathers, fur, small bones, and the sweet musky smell of fox kits. Mara called Reeves at once. When she examined the area more closely, the explanation that broke everyone's heart began to emerge. The vixen had denned near the collapsed wall in spring. While digging and enlarging the den tunnels, she must have disturbed the hidden chamber beneath the roots and leaf mold. Objects from inside, the mitten, the toy, the crayon, had likely shifted loose into the den area over time. But that alone did not explain why she brought them to Eleanor's cottage specifically. That part remained impossible until Mara noticed something else. Tufts of old blanket fabric woven into the den bedding, blue with white sheep stitched along the edge. She brought it carefully to Eleanor that afternoon. The older woman took one look and sat down hard. It was from the little blanket Oliver used to carry everywhere when he was younger, a blanket he often dragged into the garden, the lane, even into the hedgerows when he played. Over the years, scraps of its fabric had snagged all over the property. The vixen had likely used some of that material while building her den near Eleanor's cottage weeks before. She had come to know the scent of the place, and when the shifted objects from the chamber carried the same scent, Oliver's scent, Eleanor's house, that old blanket, she had carried them there. Not as a message in any human sense, not from grief, not from morality, but from instinct, pattern, recognition, the old law of animals linking one smell to another, one place to one memory. And still, somehow, it felt like more. The village held Oliver's funeral on a Sunday under pale rain. Every pew in St. Anne's Church was full. People stood in the aisle and beneath the lich gate outside. Claire wore black and did not speak through most of it. Eleanor sat beside her, holding her daughter's hand as if both of them might float away otherwise. When Reverend Hale rose to speak, he did not romanticize what had happened. "A child was lost," he said quietly. "A mother suffered. A grandmother suffered. A village suffered. Nothing can make that good." He looked down at the little coffin before continuing. "But mercy does not always arrive in forms we expect. Sometimes it comes not to undo sorrow, but to end the terrible loneliness of unanswered sorrow. And for that, in whatever strange way it came to us, we are grateful." There was not a dry eye in the church. After the burial, the villagers began leaving scraps near the edge of blackthorn copse. "Not enough to tame the fox," Mara warned sternly, "but enough to mark the place with a kind of simple reverence. Children called her the Red Messenger until their parents told them not to. Claire never used that name. She could not bear anything too poetic. But once, months later, Eleanor saw her standing quietly at the garden gate at dawn, looking out toward the fields as if waiting. "Do you think she knew?" Claire asked without turning. Eleanor was silent for a long time. "No," she said at last, honest as always. "Not the way we mean knowing." Claire nodded. Tears slid down her face anyway. "But she brought him home," she whispered. Eleanor had no answer to that. The fox was seen only rarely after that summer. A flash of russet at the field's edge, tracks after rain. Once, a shape slipping along the churchyard wall at dusk. Mara believed the vixen moved her kits elsewhere when autumn came, as foxes often do. But in Alderwick, people remembered. They remembered the scrape at the gate, the mitten on the mat, the toy, the crayon, the impossible procession of grieving humans following a wild red animal into the woods. And they remembered most of all the moment when unspeakable pain gave way, not to joy, never to that, but to the softer, more bearable ache of finally being able to say goodbye. For years afterward, Eleanor kept the blue mitten in her bedside drawer, not because it no longer hurt to touch it, it always did, but because on dark mornings when guilt and memory still woke before the sun, she would hold that little mitten in both hands and think of the fox padding through the mist with it held so carefully in her mouth, carrying not understanding, not kindness, not miracle exactly, but an ending. And sometimes, Eleanor had learned, an ending was the most merciful gift the world could give.